What's going on, everybody? J-How here, and in this Diablo 3 Demon Hunter guide, we're going to go over what could be the new meta-breaking Demon Hunter build that we have all been waiting for a very long time, and it revolves around the Shadow's Mantle set. So we'll get into the skills, the gear, and everything you need to know to make this work, but I can tell you one thing on the PTR, this thing is a lot of fun and could be one of the most interactive Demon Hunter builds that we've had in a while. So without further ado, let's get into the skills. All right, so when we take a look at the skills, you can put these in any order that you want. I just have a preference in terms of how I set them up. But for the skills, Marked for Death, Valley of Death. Mark an area on the ground of 15-yard radius for 15 seconds. Enemies in the area take 15% additional damage. Straight damage amplification, no fluff, just do more damage. Now, here's the big one. Impale with Ricochet. And we'll go over the gear here in a second so we can talk about how this works and why it's going to be so impactful. You're going to throw the knife, do that extra damage. The knife ricochets to 2 additional nearby enemies within 20 yards of each other. So you're going to throw this out. But with a new updated item in 2.5, you're going to be throwing out multiple Impale skills or abilities or knives or whatever you want to call it. You're going to be throwing out multiple ones. So that's going to be big damage going out. Now, Vault with Rattling Roll. The key thing here is the enemies you vault through are knocked away and stunned for 1.5 seconds. This can be a pretty big deal because when you vault through them, that knockback is going to pair really well with your gear, so synergy later will definitely come in. Next up, Shadow Power with Well of Darkness, although it actually doesn't really matter because you will be obtaining every single rune on this because you're going to be getting the Shadow's Mantle buff. And so key things to look out for on this is the Nightbane rune in particular. You slow the movement speed of enemies within 30 yards around you. That's going to pair really well with passive abilities and legendary gems. You can look at the rest of the ones. That one in particular is going to be good. You get life per hit. You get so much from this. You reduce damage taken. You get movement speed. It's just a really great thing to have there, but the movement slow is going to be pretty big. Next up, Vengeance with Darkheart. You are still a Demon Hunter, so when you get to those high greater rifts, you need to be able to reduce some of that damage. And hey, what better way to start off than reducing 50% of damage taken while this is up? And this is going to be basically up on 100% uptime. Companion with Wolf Companion. You don't have to have a ton of cooldown reduction, but this is just kind of an extra buffer there to have that extra damage and to be able to proc this as needed. When it comes to your passives, we're going to go with Ambush. You deal 40% additional damage to enemies above 75% health, and I can tell you that at high greater rifts, you will be one-shotting a lot of low health enemies, especially with Ambush, which allows you to get to the next wave. Impale only puts out so many projectiles. It allows you to hit more people more often by finishing them off early. So that's a key thing to look for. Leech. This is just going to help you stay alive at those high greater rifts. Life per kill, actually not too bad if you think about it with this, but life per hit, kind of a big deal. Next up, Numbing Traps. I talked about the Shadow Power rune. You get the extra slow. Well, this pairs very well. Enemies you slow, chill, or hit with, yada yada, but the slow element have their damage reduced by 25% for 5 seconds. There's not a lot of options here with this build in particular, but again, damage mitigation is a big deal. And speaking of the slow, Cull the Weak is your last passive. Increase damage against slowed or chilled enemies by 20%. So now you're increasing damage and you are slowing things in a very large radius around you. So now you see the damage amplification, the damage mitigation between these, but we're not done yet because we're going to get into the gear where you get even more synergy out of all of these skills in your gear, including the Shadow's Mantle set. Now, we'll start right away by looking at the Shadow's Mantle set, because 2-piece bonus, while equipped with a melee weapon, your damage is increased by 1200%. That's a pretty big deal. 4-piece, we already talked about it. Shadow Power gains the effect of every rune and lasts forever, which means you only have to press the button once when you go in, or press it again when you die. The 6-piece bonus, Impale, deals an additional 40,000% weapon damage to the first enemy hit. I talked about using Ambush. This is one thing that pairs really well with it. You get that big boost of damage. It's already increased by 40,000%. Then you expound on that with the Ambush, and you can see that you're doing a lot of damage and one-shotting a lot of healthy minions and enemies and monsters in those greater rifts. So Shadow's Mantle, really cool. The 4-piece bonus is the main deal, but this is also where using Impale comes in. Now, when we look at some of the rest of the gear, the weapon, Carle's Point. This is a dagger, which you do have to have a melee weapon equipped. This says Impale will return hatred if it hits an enemy already impaled. So this is one way to make sure that you never run out of hatred. You can spam Impale as many times as you possibly can. Plus, you get that damage bonus for the Shadow's Mantle. Now, the big deal that makes all of this work and why Shadow's Mantle is now a little bit more of a bigger deal, including a few other small tweaks, is the Holy Point shot. The secondary, the passive on this, I should say, it now says Impale throws 2 additional knives. So in high greater rifts, you had to have some type of AoE damage or multiple target damage. And that was very limited. That's why it didn't work that well. But with this, you now throw 2 additional knives. This is still under test for a couple of things that are going on that they have on the PTR patch notes. But understand that this will allow you to do a significantly more amount of damage, including with that ricochet rune. So you get a lot out of it. Making sure to have the lightning skill damage, crit hit chance, attack speed, and impale damage. If you can get all that, great. The lightning skill damage obviously is going to be a pretty big deal, but try and get all that on here. The Holy Point shot is definitely a big deal. Now, the next one, Chain of Shadows, your belt. After using Impale, Vault costs no resource for 2 seconds. Now, we already talked about using the Rattling Roll rune. We'll get to the next piece of gear here in a second. But you can now use Impale, Vault, Stun, Knockback, and amplify damage that way. And so using this is a pretty big deal with Chain of Shadows because your bracers will be the strong arm bracers. Enemies hit by knockbacks suffer anywhere between 20 to 30% increased damage for 6 seconds. Now, we already talked about the Rattling Roll rune. You pair that with Impale, using Impale, and then using that with the Chain of Shadows that we just talked about. Now you can basically stun things. You can vault through them. You can knock them back. You get more damage amplification. You get so much going on. And we're not going to be done yet because we still got one item in the jewelry slot, which will really make this shine in terms of damage mitigation as well. For one ring, it's going to be the Compass Rose. While moving, damage taken is reduced. While standing still, it's going to be amplified. This just pairs really well. There's not a ton of options, so you get double benefit out of this no matter which way you're going. You're going to pair that with the Traveler's Pledge. So these are a couple things that you'll get out of this. They're not necessarily overly impactful in terms of some of the other items that we've talked about, but they actually do pair really well with this build. Now, in terms of the other ring, you have 2 options, Convention of Elements or the Elusive Ring, which means that when you use that, you get damage mitigation. So there's a couple things to look at. If you don't have the Elusive Ring, you can run something like a Unity for that damage mitigation. Because you'll be vaulting so much, that ring will allow you to mitigate more damage, but if you don't have it, the Unity, not too far behind it, it's just a matter of min-max. Now, the thing is, you can use Convention of Elements on your character, or you can use it in the cube. Whichever one is stronger, use on your character. The other one, use in your cube. So those are a couple things to look for when you are gearing. You definitely need to make sure and have all 6 pieces of the Shadow's Mantle set paired with the rest of the items that we just talked about, and you become an Impale god in greater rifts. As far as other things go, the Kanai's Cube in the weapon slot, reduce the cooldown of Vengeance by 65% by using Dawn. Now, we already talked about using the Darkheart rune to reduce all damage by 50%. Now, you don't have to go out of your way to have a lot of cooldown reduction, but if you use the diamond into your helm and you have cooldown reduction on your shoulders and your gloves, maybe one or the other, you're actually going to find that you should have pretty much close to 100% uptime. You don't have to necessarily spec for it, but if you're min-maxing at high greater rifts, you'll find that that actually is a pretty big deal. But having the Dawn in your cube with that is going to be a thing that you want to make sure and have. Now, the next part is the Aquila Cuirass in your armor slot. While above 90% primary resource, all damage taken is reduced by 50%. We already talked about Carle's Point, the weapon, which returns hatred when you attack. You have no hatred issues at all. You can spam for days and no big deal. So the Aquila Cuirass is actually going to be a really big deal to mitigate more damage. So you can see how damage mitigation and damage amplification are stacking up between the talents, the skills, and the gear, and it's just going well here. Already talked about the jewelry slot. Again, the Elusive Ring, the Convention of Elements. If you don't have one or you don't have both of those, you can use Unity as a backup. Just make sure you have a Unity on your follower to make sure you get that damage mitigation, and that way you can stay alive in high greater rifts and really push this build. Now, in terms of your legendary gems, Bane of the Trapped is such a big deal. We already talked about the gigantic aura that you get with your shadow power, so they're already going to be slowed. You don't even necessarily have to be near them with this because it's going to be such a big radius on that. You get the damage amplification off this, it's a no-brainer. The other one, Gogok of Swiftness. Not only does Impale not do a ton of AoE damage, it helps with the Holy Point shot, so this allows you to get more shots off by increasing your attack speed. It's one of the few builds that you look at and you say, attack speed's actually a lot better than what it is on a lot of other builds. So having that attack speed is going to help a lot. You also get the cooldown reduction by keeping this up. And we talked about using Vengeance. You don't necessarily have to use a ton of cooldown reduction, but this helps supplement that to make sure that you have that Vengeance on a shorter cooldown. So it's kind of a big deal to have this together with the Impale build, but also for that damage mitigation. Lastly, Bane of the Powerful. If you actually vault in and you're able to at least somewhat safely vault in directly onto elites, this is the ultimate elite killer build. You go in, you can get that single target focus. Remember, the first enemy hit takes more damage, so if you prioritize, say that yellow elite now, it will melt with this build. So Bane of the Powerful will give you that extra increased damage, especially the higher it goes, it'll last longer, so you should be able to chain this between elites. So plus this also gives you increased damage versus elites when you are at level 25 with this gem. So the trifecta here with these legendary gems will have you blasting through enemies at high greater rifts, and it'll be a far more interactive and fun build that we haven't quite seen yet out of the Demon Hunter since this has really been a thing. So that's going to do it for this Demon Hunter guide. But remember, this is on the PTR, so make sure and subscribe to check back for any updates. This is still under test, but it does seem fairly balanced in terms of the results that we see online so far on the leaderboards. It's one of the most interactive Demon Hunter builds I've seen in a while, and it's far more pleasurable to play, at least in my opinion, than it is like a strafe build, which is far more tedious, and the enjoyment out of it is nowhere near as much as you get out of the Shadows Mantle set. So go on the PTR, try this out. Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you liked the video, feel free and hit that like button below because that's always appreciated. As always, I appreciate you guys watching. Until next time, happy hunting. See you again.